I used to be someone with a plan. I don't mean a vague idea of where life might go, but an actual plan, written down in notebooks and color-coded calendars. I had a career that made sense to me. It paid my bills, gave me independence, and let me sleep at night knowing I could walk away from anything that stopped feeling right. When people ask how I ended up here, I always want to start there, before everything tilted, before I handed over the steering wheel of my life to the person I trusted most. I met my husband Mark when I was 26. We were both living in Austin then, both tired in the same way, the kind that comes from pretending you're not lonely when you actually are. He was charming without trying too hard, the kind of guy who remembered little details and followed up on them. If I mentioned a book once, he'd bring it up weeks later. If I said I was stressed about work, he'd show up with takeout and sit with me while I vented. He had ambition, or at least that's what it looked like at the time. He talked about building something together, about being a team. When we got married 3 years later, it felt earned. We had fought, made up, learned each other's moods and habits. I was working in marketing at a mid-sized firm, steadily climbing, nothing flashy but solid. Mark was in tech sales, doing well, and when his company started talking about relocating him to Denver for a promotion, we treated it like a joint decision. I remember sitting on the floor of our apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes, laughing about how adult we were being. The move was where the first crack formed, even though I didn't recognize it then. Denver was expensive, and my job didn't transfer cleanly. I tried remote work for a while, but my role slowly got phased out. Mark told me not to stress. He said his new position came with a big raise, that this was temporary, that I could take my time figuring out what I wanted next. He liked saying things like, "I've got us." And back then, it sounded comforting, not ominous. I started freelancing, then consulting, then doing less and less as Mark's schedule got heavier. He worked late, traveled often, and came home drained. Somewhere along the way, the idea that I'd eventually jump back into a full-time role got fuzzy. Mark suggested I step back completely for a bit. He framed it like a gift. He said I was always exhausted, always pushing, and that maybe it was okay to let him carry more of the load for once. I remember the exact moment I agreed. We were sitting at our kitchen island, the sun setting behind the buildings, the city glowing orange through the window. Mark reached across the counter, took my hand, and said, "Trust me." I did. I put in my notice 2 weeks later. At first, it was almost intoxicating. I handled the house, the errands, the logistics of our lives. I told myself this was still work, just unpaid and invisible. Mark started calling me his rock, his support system. But the balance shifted quickly. He controlled the money now, not in a dramatic movie villain way. Just small things, questions about purchases, comments about budgeting, jokes about how nice it must be to not have deadlines. I brushed it off because marriage is compromise, right? Because this was what partnership looked like when one person earned more. Because admitting discomfort felt ungrateful. As the months passed, Mark changed. He became more confident, but also more dismissive. He talked over me in conversations. He'd say things like, "You wouldn't get it, you're not in the industry anymore," when I tried to give input. When I pushed back, he'd remind me that his job paid for our life, the apartment, the trips, the dinners out. I told myself this was stress talking, that promotions came with pressure, that once things settled, he'd be himself again. There were nights he came home late, smelling like whiskey, and someone else's cologne layered over his own. I noticed, but I didn't accuse. I didn't want to be that wife, the insecure one with too much time on her hands. I filled my days with yoga classes, volunteering, lunches with friends who were still working and always rushing off early. I smiled and said I was taking a break, like it was a vacation I'd chosen instead of a corner I'd backed into. The first real warning sign came from a place I didn't expect. We were at a friend's birthday at a bar downtown. Loud music, sticky floors, everyone a little buzzed. Mark was across the room talking to a woman I didn't know. She was younger, maybe late 20s, wearing a blazer that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery budget. They were standing close, too close. I watched him laugh in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. When I walked over, he introduced me quickly, almost mechanically. She smiled, polite but distracted, eyes already drifting back to him as if I were an interruption. After she walked away, I asked who she was. Mark shrugged and said she worked in a different department. That was it, no big deal. But it sat in my chest, heavy and unresolved. After that, I started noticing patterns. His phone always face down, passwords changed without explanation, trips that didn't line up with what he'd mentioned before. When I asked questions, he got irritated, told me I was reading too much into things. He said I had too much time to think now that I wasn't working. That one stung more than he probably realized. I tried to talk to him about how I was feeling, not accusing, just honest. I said I felt disconnected, but I missed being equals. He listened, nodded,
then said we'd talk later because he had an early meeting. Later never came. The power imbalance was no longer subtle. It was everywhere, in how decisions got made and how arguments ended with him reminding me, implicitly or explicitly, that he was the one keeping us afloat. I hated that I'd let myself get here, hated that I'd silenced my own instincts for the sake of harmony. One afternoon, while Mark was on a work trip, I sat alone in our apartment, scrolling through job listings I felt wildly underqualified for now. I realized how dependent I'd become. Financially, yes, but emotionally too. My confidence had eroded quietly, like something being eaten away from the inside. That night, Mark called later than usual. His voice was distant, distracted. I asked where he was, and he said he was grabbing a drink with colleagues. In the background, I heard laughter. A woman's laugh, familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. When I asked who else was there was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. That was the moment something shifted. Not a confrontation, not a discovery. Just a deep, unsettling sense that I didn't know the man I'd built my life around anymore. That the trust I'd handed over so freely was being handled carelessly, maybe even weaponized. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision that led me here. Every time I'd chosen comfort over autonomy, love over self-preservation. I wasn't ready to admit what I suspected, but I knew one thing for sure. Giving up my career hadn't just changed my schedule. It had changed the power dynamics of my marriage in ways I was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a question started forming that I was terrified to answer. What exactly was Mark doing with the power I'd given him? After that night, the question didn't leave me alone.
It followed me through the apartment, into the shower, into the grocery store. It sat in the passenger seat when I drove, quiet but heavy. I stopped telling myself I was imagining things, but I also wasn't ready to face whatever the truth was. There's a strange space between suspicion and confirmation, where your brain tries to protect you by staying numb. I lived there for weeks. Mark came back from that trip like nothing had happened. He kissed me on the cheek, dropped his suitcase by the door, and complained about airport delays. He handed me a small box, some overpriced candle he said he'd picked up randomly. It felt less like a gift and more like a reflex, something he did to check a box. I thanked him anyway, because that's what I did now. I swallowed things. We fell into a rhythm that looked normal from the outside. He worked, I kept the apartment running, dinners, laundry, small talk. But I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not obsessively, not snooping yet, just noticing. The way he'd shower the second he got home, the way his phone buzzed late at night and he'd flip it over without looking, the way he suddenly cared more about how he looked when going to work events. One afternoon, I asked him casually if I could use his laptop because mine was updating. He hesitated. It was barely a second, but it was there. He smiled and said sure, then hovered while I checked my email, asking if I needed help, if the update on my computer was almost done. It was the kind of hovering that makes you feel like you're standing too close to a locked door. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake replaying that moment. I hated myself for even thinking this way. I hated that I was becoming suspicious, that I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. But I hated even more that my intuition, the one I trusted my whole adult life, was screaming at me to pay attention. I started pulling away in small ways. I stopped asking about his day. I stopped planning things for us. I told myself I was protecting my heart, but really I was testing him. I wanted to see if he'd notice. He didn't. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to address it. The money thing became sharper too. Mark started making comments that landed like jokes but felt like warnings. He'd ask why I needed to buy a certain brand, why I couldn't wait to get my hair done, whether I really needed new clothes when I wasn't even going into an office. I reminded him, gently at first, that this was still our money. He'd agree verbally, then act otherwise. One evening, after a particularly tense exchange about expenses, he said something that stayed with me. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said, "I just think it's fair that the person earning the money has a bigger say in how it's spent." He said it calmly, like it was common sense, like it wasn't a complete rewriting of the partnership we'd promised each other. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Something in my chest went cold. That was the first time I seriously thought about getting my career back, not because I missed the work, but because I missed myself. I started updating my resume quietly, late at night. I reached out to old contacts, phrasing emails carefully so they didn't sound desperate. Every rejection felt personal, like proof that I'd let too much time slip away. Then came the night that changed everything. Mark said he was going out with coworkers after a long week. He didn't invite me, which wasn't unusual anymore. I told him to have fun. He kissed my forehead, already halfway out the door. I watched from the window as he walked to his car, phone in hand, smiling at something on the screen. Hours passed. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I checked his location, something we'd always shared for safety. It showed him at a downtown hotel. Not a bar, not a restaurant. A hotel.
I stared at my phone, my heart pounding so loud I thought I might throw up. I refreshed the app. Same place. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A work thing. A conference. Anything. But he hadn't mentioned staying overnight. He hadn't packed a bag. I didn't confront him right away. I don't know why. Fear, maybe? Or shock? Or some twisted hope that if I waited, the reality would change. He came home the next morning just after 7. He smelled like soap that wasn't ours. He moved quietly, like he thought I might still be asleep. When he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed, eyes red, he froze. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, long and heavy, like I was the problem he'd been bracing himself to deal with. "Why are you up so early?" he asked. I asked him where he'd been. He told me he'd crashed at a friend's place because he'd had too much to drink. The lie came out smooth, practiced, too smooth. I told him his location showed a hotel. His face changed. Not panic, annoyance. He asked why I was checking his location, why I didn't trust him, why I was making such a big deal out of nothing. He flipped it so fast I almost believed I'd imagined everything. I told him I wasn't stupid, that I knew something was going on. He laughed, actually laughed. Then he said, "You're being paranoid. This is what happens when you don't have enough going on." That was the moment something broke cleanly inside me. Not shattered, snapped, like a cord pulled too tight for too long. I told him I wanted the truth. He looked at me for a long time. Then he sat down across from me, hands folded, and said something I'll never forget. He said, "I didn't think it would hurt you this much. I didn't hear anything after that, not really." He admitted to seeing someone from work. He said it started as mentoring, that she looked up to him, that things got complicated. He said it like it was a mutual drift, not a series of choices he made while I stayed home building a life around him. What hurt wasn't just that he cheated. It was how entitled he sounded, how comfortable, like he truly believed this was an understandable consequence of his success and my dependence. I asked him how long it had been going on. He hesitated. Then he said, "A while." I realized then that the power I'd given him wasn't just financial. It was narrative. He'd been rewriting our marriage in his head for months, maybe years, casting himself as the center and me as a supporting character who should be grateful just to be included. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, numb, thinking about how easily I disappeared inside this relationship, how much of myself I traded for stability that turned out to be conditional. Mark reached for my hand. I pulled it away. That night, I slept on the couch. Not because I didn't have the right to the bed, but because I couldn't stand the idea of lying next to him. I stared at the ceiling again. But this time, the question had an answer. He had used the power I gave him to replace me. The days after the confession blurred together in a way that still feels unreal when I think about it. We existed in the same space, but we weren't together. Mark went to work like nothing had happened. I stayed home like my world hadn't just split open. We spoke in clipped logistical sentences. Who was picking up groceries, what time he'd be back, whether the dry cleaning was ready. It felt like we were roommates who'd skipped the part where you pretend to like each other. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my friends, not my family.
I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting myself from the humiliation of having to explain how badly I'd misjudged my life. There's a special kind of shame that comes with realizing you built your entire existence on someone who didn't respect you. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Mark didn't apologize the way you'd expect someone to. He never begged, never cried. He said he was sorry in a flat, almost irritated way, like he was acknowledging an inconvenience. He told me he didn't plan for it to happen, that he never meant for it to go this far. That phrase made me want to scream, as if there were mile markers along the road to betrayal and he'd accidentally missed the exit. He said he ended things with her. I didn't ask for proof. I didn't believe him either way. What he did do was start acting like the wounded one. He complained about how tense the apartment felt, how hard it was to come home and feel judged. He told me I was distant, cold. He said things like, "I'm trying to move forward, but you're stuck." The audacity of it made my head spin. One night, about a week after everything came out, we finally fought. Not a quiet argument, a real one. The kind where words come out sharper than you intend because you've been holding them back too long. I told him he'd destroyed my trust, that he'd taken advantage of my dependence, that he'd turned my sacrifice into leverage. He told me I was exaggerating, that I'd chosen to quit my job, that he never forced me, that plenty of couples worked this way and didn't fall apart. Then he said something that rewired how I saw him permanently. He said, "If you hadn't checked out of your career, maybe I wouldn't have felt so alone." I remember staring at him, my mouth actually falling open. I asked him if he was seriously blaming me for his affair. He shrugged and said relationships were complicated, that needs go unmet, that it wasn't black and white. That was the moment I stopped hoping we could fix this.
After that, the control escalated. Subtle at first. He suggested I hold off on big purchases until things stabilized. He reminded me that if we separated, things would be financially tight for me. He didn't threaten outright, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. I was vulnerable, and he knew it. I started documenting everything, not because I had a plan yet, but because something inside me told me I needed to protect myself. I saved messages, I wrote dates down in a notebook I hid at the bottom of a drawer. I opened a separate email account and sent copies to myself. It felt sneaky, but it also felt necessary, like I was finally acting instead of just reacting. I also started lying. Small lies. I said I was meeting a friend when I was actually at the library working on job applications. I said I was running errands when I was sitting in my car on the phone with recruiters, my hands shaking as I tried to sound confident. I hated lying, but I hated being powerless more. Mark noticed the shift. He asked where I was going so often. He asked who I was talking to. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I pointed that out, he said it was different, that he was worried about me, that I seemed unstable. That word lodged itself in my brain. Unstable. As if reacting to betrayal was a character flaw. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, I finally did something I'd been avoiding. I opened our shared financial accounts and really looked. Not casually, thoroughly. I wish I hadn't. There were expenses I didn't recognize. Hotel charges that predated the night I caught him, restaurants we'd never been to together, gifts I'd never received. He hadn't just cheated emotionally or impulsively. He'd funded an entire parallel life with money we both considered ours. I sat on the floor with my laptop open, scrolling through statements, my hands numb. Every charge felt like another layer of deception peeled back. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. When I confronted him that night, he didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. He told me I was invading his privacy, that I had no right to monitor his spending like that. I reminded him it was our account. He said, I'm the one who puts money into it. That sentence erased any remaining doubt. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was his dependent, and he felt entitled to act accordingly. Something in me hardened after that, not in a dramatic, revenge-fueled way, just a quiet resolve. I stopped trying to get him to understand. I stopped explaining my pain. I started planning. I reached out to a former manager and asked for coffee. I told her the truth, not the sanitized version. I said I'd stepped away and needed back in. She didn't judge me. She told me she admired my honesty. She didn't have a job for me, but she had leads. That small kindness felt like oxygen. At home, Mark grew restless. He could sense me pulling away, even if he didn't know how far. He oscillated between charm and irritation. Some nights he acted almost affectionate, as if trying to lure me back into the version of myself that didn't question him. Other nights he was cold, distant, scrolling on his phone with a smirk that made my stomach turn. I realized then that he wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control. The final straw came during a dinner with friends. Someone asked me, casually, what I'd been up to lately. Before I could answer, Mark jumped in. He laughed and said, "She's enjoying her little break from the real world." Everyone laughed politely. I felt my face burn. I didn't correct him. I just smiled and nodded. But inside, something crystallized. I wasn't on a break. I wasn't lost. I was trapped. And I was done letting him define the story. That night, lying awake beside him, listening to his breathing, I made a decision. I didn't know exactly how I'd leave yet. I didn't know where I'd land. But I knew this marriage was already over in every way that mattered. He had taken my trust, my career momentum, my sense of self, and treated them like expendable resources. And I was done paying the price for his entitlement. I stared into the dark and felt something unfamiliar but powerful rise up in me. Clarity. I spent the next few weeks moving in slow motion, carefully, like a chess player thinking 20 moves ahead. Every interaction with Mark became calculated. I watched him, cataloged his patterns, and worked out the logistics I'd need if I left. Not because I wanted revenge, though a small guilty part of me did, but because I finally understood that his betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was systemic. He had used my dependence to control me, and I had to dismantle that from the inside before stepping out. I started by separating our finances quietly. I opened a new bank account in my name only and set up automatic deposits from the joint account to make sure I had cash without him noticing. Every transaction, every small transfer felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I felt a surge of something I hadn't in years. Ownership, control, my own agency. I also started applying for jobs aggressively, going to interviews that made me feel alive again. Each one reminded me that I wasn't just a household manager or the woman who had given up everything for a man who betrayed her. I was me, still, beneath the layers of fear and shame. Mark noticed the changes immediately. He started asking where I was going, checking if I had my phone, probing who I was talking to.
I gave minimal answers, politely, almost robotically, but he could feel the shift. The dynamic had changed. For the first time, I wasn't the dependent one. For the first time, he had to account for me in a way he never had before. Then came the confrontation I'd been preparing for in my head for weeks. I waited until he was off work, then told him I needed to talk. He leaned back on the couch, tired-looking, pretending casual concern, and asked, "About what?" I looked him in the eyes, steady. "About us," I said. The word hung in the room, heavy. I didn't flinch when I told him I knew everything, the affairs, the lies, the misuse of our money. I didn't beg for an apology. I didn't cry. I just stated the facts, calmly, almost clinically. Mark's face went through a range of expressions, from irritation to disbelief to anger. He started with excuses, claiming miscommunications, mutual misunderstandings, that I had somehow misinterpreted things. I listened, silent, letting him unravel. Then I said the words I'd rehearsed over and over in the mirror. "I'm leaving, and I don't need you to explain or justify anything. I've been dependent for too long, and I'm done. I'm taking myself back." For a moment, he just stared at me, like he couldn't compute the sentence. Then he tried to grab my arm. I pulled away. I told him not to. That was mine, that moment, mine and no one else's. The weeks that followed were logistical nightmares, but also exhilarating. I found a small apartment in a part of the city I'd always liked but never considered living in. I packed the essentials first, then the rest. Each item I removed from the apartment we shared felt like reclaiming parts of my life I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Photos, letters, mementos, he had so many. And yet, what mattered to me wasn't leaving with the things he could see or control. It was leaving with my sense of self intact. Mark tried to negotiate, of course. He offered more money, a temporary truce, the promise to change, the pleading tone that once could have softened me. But I had changed. I had spent months building myself back up, testing my own strength, reclaiming the independence I'd lost. I had seen what he was capable of when power was in his hands, and I knew I could never hand that power back to him. The final day I left, I did it silently, efficiently. No dramatics, no confrontations, just me walking out the door with a single suitcase, my keys in my hand, my heart pounding in a way that was equal parts fear and freedom. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the man who had made me doubt my worth. I just drove, feeling every mile of reclaiming my life, knowing that the next step was mine to define. In my new apartment, I unpacked slowly. Each item I placed on a shelf or in a drawer felt symbolic. My life was mine again, piece by piece. I reconnected with friends who had drifted away when I'd been entirely consumed by my marriage. I went back to interviews, attended networking events, and finally landed a position that made me feel competent, challenged, and alive. The salary wasn't as high as what we'd had together, but that didn't matter. I had something even more important: autonomy. I never told anyone the full story publicly. I couldn't. It was too raw, too private, too shame-filled in ways people wouldn't understand. But I have told myself the truth every day since, that I was brave enough to leave, that I could trust myself to rebuild, that the life I gave up for a man who betrayed me could be reclaimed, stronger and more authentic than before. Sometimes I think about Mark, what he's doing, who he's with, whether he even remembers the woman he used to call his partner. And sometimes I don't care, because the truth I've come to know is more powerful than the betrayal. I am not defined by the way someone else chose to use me. I am defined by the moment I decided I wouldn't be used anymore. I gave up my career, my independence, my time, and my trust, and it hurt in ways I can't describe. But walking away, taking it all back, and realizing I am still whole, that's a feeling I can't trade for anything. Freedom tastes bitter at first, but it grows sweeter every day. The hardest part wasn't leaving him. The hardest part was believing I could. Once I did, everything else fell into place. I had survived the person I loved most betraying me, and I had rebuilt the life I deserved. And for the first time in years, I understood what it really meant to be alive again.